When I was little, I first wanted to be a writer, but then decided that I should study architecture to fund my interest in writing. I had no interest in advocacy, and being raised on watered down black history, I never really felt like I had anything in common with people like that. Please note that this is a feature, not a bug, of the school system when it teaches black history. In fourth grade, I had a teacher who decided that black people were stupid and did her level best to make sure I was on her bad side whenever I was in class. This was a problem for two reasons, the first of which that I had started the school year with a black teacher who had left on maternity leave, and the second being that I was in the gifted program. A friend of mine and I enjoy the joke that gifted usually just means segregated, but I guess to promote the lie that all the children are gifted, such programs are required to let a few of us lesser mortals into the class. Well, I noticed the double standard between the behavior standards being held for me and those being held for the, other students. Despite my reputation of being alternatively a nerd and a class clown, it was easier to get people to leave me alone if I bothered to entertain them. I was uninterested in being labeled as a troublemaker, which I absolutely was not. However, even though I pointed out inconsistencies and made straight A's in class, this teacher would not budge on her mentality that black people were stupid. Therefore, I drew a comic of her calling me a nigger and accidentally let it fall on the floor in front of her when we switched classes. While that resulted in a call to my parents, it also resulted in my having more time away from her than with her, which meant that I could finally get back to being an entertaining and neurotic student. When I got home, I was not punished, which should let people know that some parents have begun to understand trends. Though I respect the idea of consequences, it is irrational to punish people for being born a color that one dislikes from a culture that one refuses to understand. Advocating for ourselves is something that black people are forced to do when growing up in predominantly white cities, especially when growing up in the good neighborhoods, meaning white and segregated. There were 4 black students in my 6th grade graduating class, and since all people grew up in segregated areas, my black colleagues and I were apparently responsible for fulfilling all of the stereotypes that everyone had about black people, a mindset that would continue as I got older. Even though I would do my best to keep the neurotic class clown personality active, I was struck by how many times I was forced to stop being goofy and make it clear that black people were human beings. My being in magnet schools for 6 years did not help, especially since I grew up in West Austin and magnet schools were nothing more than a desegregation tactic used by many cities to entice white students to neighborhoods of color to raise funds. Later, the city would simply shut down schools in non-white neighborhoods for failing to meet standards, quietly creating the ethno-state they richly desired. Under the dominant narrative, black people were first and foremost physical slaves, forced to perform constant activity, lest we get categorized as lazy or forced to endure violence. During the current era, we are largely emotional slaves because it is considered acceptable that we assuage the insecurities of strangers. Throughout my education, there were various cases of teachers justifying the atrocities of the United States based on other imperial examples, and people like me were required to smile and nod. A history teacher stated that indigenous genocide was reasonable because of the violence within that culture, and a biology teacher claimed that indigenous people were just as environmentally destructive. For them, I now offer that even though Greece developed democracy, Greece had slaves, because apparently a democracy cannot exist without slavery. Violence and coercion are the results of unchecked insecurities, and because no one will admit to insecurities, no one can either validate or ignore them. As was made clear by several students and parents, I was not the target population for gifted and talented education, as people wanted white students in those programs more than anything else. While my classmates were recruited to the University of Texas at Austin and stayed at the overnight recruiting event, I had yet to receive any information, despite my parents being alumni of the University of Texas at Austin School of Law. Out of spite, I refused to apply there at all, so Abigail Fisher could have had my spot in 1999. But my guidance counselor tried to manipulate me into applying because of my unrealistic college aspirations. Despite my guidance counselor's help, I was accepted into Washington University, Yale University, University of Chicago, and Northwestern University. Most of my classmates and their parents took it as a personal affront and made the last 2 months of high school more miserable than the rest. In college, I participated in two major protests. First, Yale kept the classes going on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and as students at a private institution that had almost no holidays except for the designated breaks, we decided to march and rally and succeeded in shutting down classes for that day onward, beginning in the year 2001. My second protest was a march on Washington, which was pretty heady stuff for someone majoring in African American studies who had learned about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Supreme Court was rehearing Brown versus Board in 2003, so on April 1st, 2003, several groups traveled down to Washington, D.C. to protest the reversal of integration. Having learned about protests and the supposed results from the civil rights movement, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself and like I was truly becoming a part of the history I had studied. After graduating from Yale, I was scheduled to complete the New York City Teaching Fellows while teaching history from a more marginalized perspective, but like many other teachers, both prospective and practicing, I failed the teacher certification test due to a lack of study materials. This was so depressing that I was manipulated into returning to Austin, Texas, and while I found ways to be happy, I also realized that Austin is nothing more than a constant demand to advocate for one's humanity in a city where most people are determined to make Black people their pets, props, and tokens.